You're listening to Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show on 94.4 FM. Salford City Radio for your host, Jimmy Petruzzi. Bringing you news from the local area and around the world. We're very fortunate in this show to have interviewed some of the world's best athletes, sports people, coaches, people in the field of sport across many, many different disciplines. We also have a segment where we speak to people in the field of psychology and related fields, some of the most influential people in the field of psychology around the world. We like to sort of bring the world to Salford to the rest of the world, so we like to get international perspectives on things as well. The aim of the show is to increase awareness and participation in sport and give us a perspective of how things work in different countries as well. So today we have a fascinating guest who is a sports psychologist and researcher all the way in Norway. Henrik Herrebrøden is going to give us a bit of an insight into the world of sports psychology and no doubt other interesting information in terms of his perspective on things, all things related to sports psychology. So Henrik, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you on board, Henrik. So, I mean, we sort of start with the beginning of yourself in terms of like what got you into sports psychology? What was your motivation to go into the field of sports psych?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I guess it starts with me being interested in sports all the way. I started playing sports when I was 5, started playing football, soccer, and went into tennis. I've been playing volleyball. But I think in terms of my interest for psychology, I think my family was important. They've always been hardworking people, talking to me about goals, how to achieve goals. But I think especially my mom was important. She was very interested in psychology. She was doing NLP coaching, also doing a bit of hypnotherapy. So I mean, she would have loved me being on this show. So I think that was important because I remember she gave me this book when I was 14 years old. She gave me this book on like mental training, tools and tips like imagery, goal setting. Yeah. That sort of opened my mind to the possibility of improving your mental capacity in a systematic way in order to perform better. And as I started doing those things, like started doing some imagery and systematized mental training, I think that got me more involved, more aware of these things, and that led me to study sports science and a degree in psychology where I focused mainly on my biggest passion, sports.
Yeah. No, it's interesting stuff. And just for our listeners, Henrik, how's it working in sort of Norway in terms of sort of going into the field of sports psychology? Obviously, you know, different countries have probably got their own sort of requirements, but in terms of, say, sort of Norway, so is the pathway generally for university or how does sports psych work? I'm obviously, you know, I'm not sure the questions in the scope of your remit, but just give us a general view. How do you get into sports psychology in Norway?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's actually a few different ways. We have a licensing in Norway so that you actually need a certain program to call yourself a psychologist. Yeah. Which is called the professional program or a professional degree. So that's what I have, which gives me the right to call myself a psychologist. And then, but I mean, there's a lot of people working with sports psychology that are not necessarily psychologists. They may call themselves different titles, but you can also do like a master's degree or a bachelor's degree in sports psychology, and people do different things. But in my case, I've done the clinical training to become a psychologist, and I've sort of taken sports science and different courses on the side, in addition to now doing a PhD focusing on sports psychology. But I think the clinical basic psychology program is my background and the background of a lot of people here in Norway.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I, from what you've said there, I suppose there are certain parallels to the UK as well, without sort of going to all the depths and that sort of stuff. But I can sort of see some similarities. In terms of yourself, I mean, what would you say some of the challenges have been sort of getting into the field? I mean, how's sports psychology perceived in Norway, Henrik? How do sort of sports people sort of see the use of sports psych over in Norway?
I think it's getting better and better in terms of more people opening opening their eyes to sports psychology, but I think we were a bit slow to start. I think the United States, for example, have been doing sports psychology more systematically for years, way ahead of us. But nowadays it's getting more and more common, for example, that professional football teams have their own sports psychology consultants. And times are better in terms of jobs or assignments being available, but I'm not going to lie, it's a challenge. If you want to work full-time as a sports psychology consultant here in Norway, it's not easy, and a lot of people have to do a little bit of different things on the side to make ends meet. But I think it's a good period of time to be in right now, because the awareness, it's getting more and more popular, I think.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and we sort of see and hear a lot of footballers talk about the psychology side of the game in general. I mean, psychology's come a long way, I think, all over the world in terms of, well, at least in sort of in football. Obviously, it's been in other sports for a long time. And I mean, like, in terms of, like, what's your sort of perception of say psychology in football? I mean, how do you feel psychology? I know it's a very, very abstract question, but just generally speaking, how do you feel psychology can help people playing in football? What are some of the things that like psychology can help, like to a footballer, for example?
Well, first of all, I think it's good to create the awareness that there are human beings playing. They are not X's and O's that you can just ask to go there or play in that formation. There's actually a human being, and concepts like information overload, for example, cognitive psychology can help coaches, parents understand that when you yell 1,000 instructions at the same time, either from the stands or from the coaching position, that can actually overload the player, and all your wonderful tactics will not have an impact because it's too much. So I think just the awareness that there's a human being, and then you can add all kinds of cognitive concepts. And we have an expert here in Norway on football psychology, Geir Jorde, who's been doing research on penalty kicks, for example. If you wanna score from the penalty spot, it's a good thing to take your time. You should have a pre-shot routine. I think those concepts have turned out to help a lot of people, and I think the performance side is helped by research showing how the human being, what it's like and what it needs to perform, I think.
That's really interesting that you mentioned the sort of penalties. Obviously, with the sort of World Cup recently, we've seen, obviously penalties being a key component. And I mean, it's really interesting stuff. I mean, I find that, set pieces in general are pretty fascinating. In terms of, say, penalties, I mean, I think for me, Henrik, there was this sort of misconception for a long time that you couldn't practice penalties, at least in football. A lot of people used to sort of say that. I think now people begin to realise that obviously the psychological part is a big variable in terms of any aspect of the game, football, but particularly penalties. But you mentioned there sort of penalties, for example. I mean, what's your take on the psychology of sort of penalties? I can fully appreciate, obviously, players have got a high level expectation and so on and so forth, but ultimately in the end, a penalty kick is still a penalty kick. I mean, it is what it is, But what's your sort of take on the psychology of sort of penalties in terms of the research you've mentioned there, and what's your sort of take on all that?
My take is that it probably helps to be prepared. Yeah. Even though a lot of people will meet me and others by saying, "Oh, it's so different when the pressure is on. Yeah. It's such a different experience, so you cannot really create the tension and the arousal that comes with an actual shootout." And that's the same you get with the Olympic final in a different sport. You cannot create the same environment. But I think the research is clear that even though you cannot create the exact same environment, it helps to sort of recreate parts of it. And it's kind of like a vaccine. If you use a vaccine, you insert a little bit of the virus or whatever, and that will create this response in your body, makes you more prepared to go out and face the real disease. I think it's the same way. If you insert a little bit of pressure and a little bit of the same elements in your training as you will face in the competition, I think that will help.
Yeah, so I mean, we can sort of prepare, we can sort of practice. I mean, obviously, you know, it's impossible to create the scenario exactly the same, but we can give ourselves the best chance possible is as much as any of us can do. And I think for me, the frustration is sometimes, Henrik, when, you know, I don't mind personally if the keeper saves it, does a world-class save. Sometimes we're beaten by sporting brilliance, but I think where it's frustrating is when the player underperforms and completely misses the target. When you think, okay, well, as a professional, you know, the least you can do is sort of to force the sort of keeper, if that makes any sense, to make a save. You know, is there some sort of mileage in that, do you think, in terms of, like, you know, working with players psychologically, saying, okay, well, you know, sometimes you will get beaten by brilliance, but just give you know, your best shot, really focus on the process.
Yeah, I think sports psychology is targeting exactly that, and I think a lot of the interventions is not always about increasing your best performance, but it's also about limiting your worst performance. So following mental training, following some of these guidelines in sports psychology, I think you can raise your lower level so that your worst performance is not as bad. And there's a lot of people saying that after a period of working on this psychological stuff, you can have the experience that you don't choke as much, you don't give your worst as often. I think that's a key target in the sports psychology field.
And sort of sport in general in Norway, I mean, obviously sort of, you know, produced some fantastic footballers over the years, and certainly in the Winter Olympic Games, you know, always finishes around about the top, really. I mean, what's sport like in general in Norway, just for our listeners, Henrik, just out of interest in terms of, like, how, you know, how sort of popular is sport in Norway, and where does sort of football sit in Norway in terms of its popularity amongst other sports?
That's a very interesting question, and probably a lot of my colleagues could give better answers. Yeah. I've been working with this sports sociologist, Christian Thue Bjørndal, at the Norwegian School of Sports Science, and he knows a lot about this. But in general, my impression is that Norwegian sports is a little bit more, I was going to say unprofessional, but it's more based on voluntary work and the grassroots work. And we tend to, for example, start with professional football academies a bit later than some other countries. And we tend to keep athletes in their home environment for a bit longer. We have kind of strict rules on how professional, quote-unquote professional, the training environment of kids can be. And coaches don't get paid a lot, especially when they're working with youth. So we have this sort of broad model where we like to keep athletes for a long time before we start to sort of specialize. And we also like athletes to have the opportunity to do multiple sports up until kind of a late age. So that's a bit of the controversy. How effective is that? And people are debating that in Norway, and some other people from other countries are looking towards Norway because we, like you said, do well in the Olympics, especially the Winter Olympics. So some people say that maybe the late specialization and the grassroots work and the voluntary work can have some good sides. And the question is, some other people may say it should be more professional, but overall, my view is that we tend to wait for a longer period of time until the athlete is older before we sort of start with a very professional and specialized approach.
That's really interesting. And in terms of, say, I suppose it would be interesting to see your perspective on, obviously everyone's going to have our own perspective, but what's the sort of general perspective on you know, Haaland over at City at the moment? I mean, obviously sort of like, you know, at the moment, you know, it's this incredible season he's sort of having. And I mean, what's the perspective in general around sort of Haaland, how well he's sort of doing? I know he's done well for a long time before he came to the UK, but sort of just generally speaking, what's the feel around sort of Haaland and his ability and how he's getting on in the Premier League?
Well, he's obviously a huge talking point over here, and people like to give various accounts of why he became great. A lot of people will take the opportunity to praise the Norwegian system because he was able to stay in his home club until he was, 14 or 15, and he was even playing with girls on the same team.
Wow.
He was, the system was typical Norwegian in the sense that they had players from different skill levels and kept it in the home environment until he was a teenager, and then he moved to a bigger club, and then he moved to a different country, and we all know the rest of that story. So he obviously trained a lot, and they had good facilities where he lived, so he could train pretty much whenever he wanted. He had a lot of friends. They had a good environment, good people, good coaches. So in his local context, it was a good environment for football, and some people say that's where the foundation is. Obviously, his father was very good. He played for Manchester City. I believe that's important. So you have so many factors that can play a role here, and people like to give, depending on the club you ask, they will say
of course,
he became great at various stages, right?
Yeah, and absolutely. And it's really interesting having mentioned that. I mean, I don't recall who the researcher was off the top of my head, but I was reading a research paper around his ability to sort of scan around him, like his ability to sort of, be able to sort of make, I suppose this is my words and not the researcher's words, but his ability to sort of make those sort of mental pictures to be able to sort of anticipate was really incredible in terms of the ability to sort of be able to sort of see what's around him, that sort of level of awareness. And would you say I suppose it's a tricky one really. I suppose it's genes, environment, suppose to explain behaviour to a certain point. But you mentioned there the environmental influences. But what about say how much do you think is sort of our ability? Maybe we're born with certain genes in terms of to be able to adapt to situation. What's your sort of take on the sort of genes, environment components of brilliance in sports, Henrik?
My take is that it's both. It's genes and environment, and I think Haaland is a great case on how it's both, because you cannot deny that his physical abilities are very important, right? It's a very strong body. He obviously has some good genes, and I remember this came up when the Netflix documentary on Michael Jordan came a couple of years ago, The Last Dance. Michael Jordan, Scott Pippen, some of the best basketball players of all time, they would interview the coaches that coached them when they were teenagers, and sometimes they would say, okay, they were good players, but once they developed all the skills and they started to grow, and that physical presence came into the equation as well, then it became spectacular. So I think to be that type of player in basketball and like Haaland in soccer, I think the physical component and thereby the genetic component is very important as well.
Absolutely. And in terms of yourself, you mentioned there sort of the PhD and your future research. which, if you don't mind me asking, direction sort of are you going to go in, Henrik, yourself? Obviously, just sort of out of interest, I only share we're sort of comfortable sharing, but what's your sort of general vision for yourself in terms of the field of sports psych? Where do you sort of see yourself in terms of the direction you take the sports psych?
And that's a very good question. I know for sure I would like to keep exploring what I explore now, and that is cognitive psychology in sports. And one of the beauties is that, like you mentioned, Haaland, with the scanning and the perception, those are things that are a bit harder to observe and measure than, for example, how tall he is or how strong he is. And I think there's very much a lot of potential for sports and football in this case when it comes to cognitive factors, because you have a lot of players with a lot of success that may not be very easy to explain just based on the physical capacity, or the speed, for example. So you have a lot of midfielders, for example, who are doing these amazing things, and I think only now we're starting to explore how that is, for example, how they perceive, how they scan, how they make decisions. So that's my general field of interest, and who knows what the future brings, but for now I'm doing research. I think that's fascinating, and I also enjoy working with football clubs. I work with young players. I work with individuals on the side, so for me it will be fascinating to just keep doing what I do.
It's really interesting. I mean, in terms of yourself, just out of interest and for our listeners, when you work in football yourself, I mean, what sort of work do you do in terms? I know obviously it's going to be no 2 days the same, but what generally do you do to help with performance, Henrik? I suppose I'm asking this question out of personal interest too, really, in terms of, you know, one of the things that fascinates me is how cognitive psych is going to sort of influence a lot of training in the future. We're seeing it now more and more. Not just sort of, you know, psychology is not just about sitting in a club. There's also like different exercises in terms of what players do. Are underpinned by psychology, but what do you do yourself in terms of like what are some of the things that you do when you work with footballers? Obviously, you know, there's some things you're going to keep confidential, but just to have a general interest, what are some things that you do when you work with footballers?
Right, I mean that would naturally depend on the individual, but there are a few common topics that sort of recur and I keep coming back to when I work with players, and I guess the most common reason that a young football player will reach out to me and ask for help is usually that they feel like they underperform in the big moments. So they will tend to say, I'm great in practice, I feel good, I perform well. In the not so important games I can do well, but when the big day comes and there's a big game or a tryout or something that matters, then it's for some reason more difficult to perform. I feel different and I struggle with that. I need some help figuring out how am I going to be my best when it matters the most. That would be the number one reason I think why people have approached me over the years. And the second reason I guess would be some kind of adversity, that perhaps an injury or some club-related reason why they are unable to play, or life is just harder now than it used to be for some reason. I think those two, the pressure and the adversity, would be the prime reasons.
That they come along and sort of seek, you know, assistance. And in terms of sort of the club situation in Norway, I mean, we're seeing in the UK, you know, certainly in Premiership teams and I suppose, you know, maybe even championship teams, but more and more anyway, the advent of people sort of, you know, you see more people like, bringing in sports psych, for example. Is it the sort of the case in Norway in terms of clubs? Are they bringing in sort of people like yourself to sort of to work with teams as well as individuals, or is it more of an individual thing?
It's still an individual thing, but it's getting more common to do it on a team level as well. So I don't have numbers, but I would guess that quite a few of the top teams in Norway have their own, if not on-site psychologists, like with them all the time. They would at least have someone that they have some deal with, so that they can reach out and maybe ask the consultant to have a chat with this player or this player or even the coach. So it's getting more common, but it's still an individual thing. And if I may, I think also the players sometimes feel more comfortable if it's an individual thing, because we've had a few debates on this in Norway, how the confidentiality is sometimes hard to live by if you're working in a team, because you'll have a coach who wants to know, okay, so what are you guys talking about? And there's been a few horror stories on how the confidentiality has been broken. So unfortunately, there are quite a few players who feel more comfortable to reach out to some psychologist or whoever who they can work with on an individual basis.
Yeah, and absolutely, that's a great point, Henrik. I personally, in my own opinion, I think in the future where things will probably go is there'll be a blend of both, where you've got perhaps someone working with a sort of team in that team environment, but there'll be limits to what they do, and maybe then players will work individually with certain things. I suppose depending on what the issue is, the complexity of the issue. Basically, it's sort of trying to get that balance is the sort of key. But I think that from what I'm hearing, speaking to yourself, is quite interesting, really. In some respects, psychology, even in the UK, in football, has taken some time, and I suppose, like we sort of touched on very, very briefly before, about the variables. How do we measure success in that variable? Sometimes is not as linear as, say, physically. So physically, you can time someone how fast they sprint 20 meters, whatever, you get a time. But psychology, I mean, just out of interest, do you have ways to sort of do you use self-report measures yourself in terms of to see if the player is progressing, or just generally think, well, if they're playing better, then that's a sign that what I'm doing is working?
Well, for now, I think we still haven't developed good enough tools for that. I think we have some tools, like, for example, there are questionnaires and ways that you can ask the player about the relationship. How do you think this work we're doing is going? And of course, also the observation of their performance, and you ask them questions, and you may have goals that you evaluate. But to be honest with you, this is one of the things that I think I and many others should get better at. I think we should keep looking for ways so we can evaluate ourselves. The typical way is that you work with someone, and if they do great on the pitch, you feel great as a psychologist. I mean, you tend to put the equation mark between their performance and your performance. Now, I don't think that's a sensible way to do it. I think we should explore ways so we can measure mental progress in a better way than we're doing now. But it's difficult, but I think we should keep exploring that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And I suppose there's other things now that technology can be quite helpful in terms of, say, game analysis. I think that the club, if everyone sort of ties in and works together, then through game analysis, perhaps we can sort of see if the play is sort of maybe like winning more tackles or having more shots. And I mean, obviously it's hard to quantify the psychological variables, but at least if the play is performing, it's a sort of a great way to sort of move forward. But I suppose that there's always going to be there's only so much time in terms of players for training as well, in terms of like how much time gets dedicated on every area. But I know it's a sort of very difficult sort of questions to quantify. I guess for our listeners, really, in terms of it's hard to quantify. But I mean, how important do you think that the psychological variable is yourself? And obviously you've studied and you've had a lot of experience in the field. I mean, what do you see? How important do you think the psychological variable is for an athlete, for a footballer, in the context of sort of all the variables to perform at your best?
Well, it's absolutely crucial, because without the mental factor, your physical factor, your technical factor, your tactical factor will not come into play, right? Because even the physical stuff, there's even research on, if you're mentally exhausted, you have mental fatigue, you will not perform optimally on a running test, for example. So even the simple task of running until exhaustion is way worse if you're mentally fatigued. And if you're on the pitch and you're running around and you're concerned, you're distracted, you think about the consequence of failure, you won't be in the game. I mean, your body will be in the game, but your mind will not be in the game, and you'll be way less receptive to whatever the coach might say and to the tactics. You may be in the wrong position. And you have players, if you work with them, all of a sudden their touch gets better, their positioning gets better. So it's absolutely crucial, but that's because the mental factor ties into the other factors. I mean, it's physical and mental at the same time. And there's no way to isolate the components, but in terms of your question here, I think the mental side is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you mentioned there sort of individually working with players. And one thing that I've noticed over the years, Henrik, is that players if they're in a team environment, can behave completely different to when you speak to them individually, for example. So like if they're amongst players in the team, sometimes you see a completely different sort of person to what you will see individually in terms of their behaviour and the way they open up. And I think, do you think that's an important point in terms of like working with players individually as well as just a team environment on its own?
Yeah, and the same person can behave differently with this person as opposed to that person, right? And
absolutely.
And I think that a lot of people overemphasize what the player might say sometimes. I mean, a lot of players know how to say the right things.
Yeah.
And they can be good so-called clubhouse players, like they can know how to behave in the clubhouse. They can say the right things to the coach. They can act professionally, but when they get onto the pitch, they may not have what it takes to back it up, or vice versa. You can have someone may not appear as dedicated, as motivated, and as professional, but they actually do the job out on the pitch. So, which is why I personally like to emphasize the observable factors, like what they actually do out on the pitch, as opposed to what they just tell you as the psychologist or the coach.
Absolutely, that's a great point. Absolutely, I think that goes. I suppose even outside, sports psych, it's one thing saying, and I suppose that's what the self-report measures is. It's one thing sort of filling in a self-report measure or questionnaire, but then going out there is a whole different sort of situation altogether. And the observable, I think that's a sort of really, really interesting point you've made there in terms of observation. In terms of sort of observation. I suppose there's an opportunity for the sports psychologist to observe the team and sort of watch the team from that perspective. Like I suppose if a team can bring a sports psych to a game and say, okay, can you sort of see if you can pick anything up? Do you think that's sort of a role in the future, if it's not already being done now, Henrik, where sort of a coach might say to a sports psychologist, if you come along and watch the game and sort of tell me your thoughts psychologically, not technically, more psychological perspective, what's your take on the players?
Yeah, I think that's being used right now, and I think it's going to be more of that in the future. I've personally been doing that. I've been sitting with the coaching staff, and sometimes I observe the coach. I observe what types of instructions they give, the types of feedback they give, and I categorize that into different categories. And sometimes I observe the player, like transitioning, how do they lose focus, stuff like that. But I know there's a lot of ongoing work on that. I think there's a project by Geir Jorde up at the Norwegian School of Sports Science where they actually try to look into body language and the sort of non-verbal communication, how we might be able to read something just based on body language and the player's behavior, how the psychology might reveal itself in that. And I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we have all the data to improve at least performance at a high level yet, but I think we are slowly getting there, and I think that's very exciting.
Absolutely, that's fascinating. It's been really fascinating speaking to you, Henrik. I found it really, really fascinating. I know that the listeners have found it really interesting, your sort of perspective on things, and also, just obviously, it's been really, really fascinating in terms of what you do, and absolutely. So I really want to thank you for coming aboard the show. It's been great speaking to you. We wish you sort of all the best in your sort of future career and endeavours in the field of sports psychology and research. So that was Henrik Herrebrøden, all the way from Norway, a sports psychologist and researcher, is kind enough to sort of join us to give us an insight into the field of sports psych over in Norway. It's a field that a lot of people are passionate about, and a lot of our listeners sort of enjoy the conversations that I have when we have guests who sort of talk about that sort of field. So it's been really kind enough to join us. Thank you, Henrik. It's been great to speak to you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.